Hello and welcome back to another book review. First of all, if you're new here, I post new book reviews almost every single day on both fiction and non-fiction books, so if you want to get some reading inspiration or if you just like following book reviews, then feel free to stick around. I'd love to have you. Today I'm going to be reviewing a book that was inspired by another book that I read. The book is Mother Tongue: The Surprising History of Women's Words by Jenni Nuttall. So I recently read Language in Danger, which was this book that talked about dying languages and languages that are in danger, languages that do not have a lot of native speakers, and it was a very, very interesting book that I read. One of the things they talked about in that book was how some words from these languages, even though they are dying, have been borrowed into languages that are more widely spoken, words from dying or since deceased, I guess you could say, Native American languages that have been borrowed into English, and other examples like that. So after reading that, it kind of reignited a spark that I had within me to read more books about the etymology of words. So I have always had this fascination with the words in a language and where they come from. For example, knowing where these words that we speak in English came from, knowing their history, maybe how the meaning of a word has changed over time. I just find it interesting, and every once in a while I fall back down that rabbit hole, usually after Googling something. This is something I've had an interest in for a very long time. I remember in high school English class, we had to write a paper on the etymology of some words that we had chosen, and I just found that paper so interesting that I wrote well over the required number of pages because I just found it so interesting. So after reading Language in Danger, it kind of reignited the spark. I went back to that section of the library that deals with words and language, and I found Mother Tongue. I decided to give this a read, not necessarily because I was looking for a book on women's words, but because I was looking for a book on the etymology of words, and this just seemed to be a nice, interesting, tidy topic to talk about. The book is not academically inclined at all. It's definitely for the lay person. It's a little over 250 pages, so about your average book length, I would say, and definitely accessible to anyone. You don't have to have any special linguistic background to enjoy or understand this book. The book overall, as mentioned from the title, covers women's words, and when I first checked this out, I wasn't sure what it was going to entail, but I assumed female anatomy. I assumed it meant things that women experience like childbirth, menopause, aging, and also maybe things that occur in a woman's life. I kind of was trying to grasp at what might women's words be, and I was mostly correct. So it really does focus on words that describe things that many women go through. So obviously not every woman is going to, for example, give birth to children in their lifetime, but it's something that we can put broadly under a general women's experience, or things that some women or a large portion of women will experience in their life. So we do talk about female anatomy. There's a whole section just on menstrual language. We have words that talk about women's worlds. We have things like nursing children, raising children. We also have industry, so women and the jobs that they do, so like the work, the job titles that they described doing, which I found that chapter more interesting than I thought it was going to be. I really enjoyed hearing about how these words were created or used in the English language, and I also enjoyed reading about how women use those words to describe themselves. One thing that they talked about in this chapter, the author, Jenni Nuttall, talked about, is women were more likely to describe themselves as doing something, while men would give themselves a job title. So just little interesting things like that, the way that women described work that they did, as well as things like negative instances that occurred, so violence that's perpetrated against women, and the words that we use to describe that. So again, I was more or less correct. Words that describe a general woman's experience are kind of all captured together, and the etymology of these words are discussed. It's really just a book with a lot of interesting tidbits, a lot of interesting etymological trails that you could follow, and I'm sure you can follow further if they interest you, and it was an enjoyable book to read. I feel like it's the kind of book where you get some fun facts out of it and maybe spark an interest into going further if anything in here interests you. The one fun fact that I did take from this that I enjoyed was, and it's on page 166 for those of you who want to follow along in your own copy of the book, they talk about where the word lady comes from in English. We have the word lady, so I feel like it conveys a sense of propriety, maybe nobility, such as Lady, I don't know, Lady Jane, Lady Smith. And it comes from two words in Old English that come from loaf, kneader. So it really describes a very common, basic routine thing that women did for a long time. A A lot of women were responsible for the cooking, baking part of everyday life. So that loaf kneader, the author mentions the most highest crust of society who uses that term lady are inherently using a word that stemmed from this very common everyday experience that almost all women would have experience with, which was kneading bread. Of course, nowadays, not everyone makes their own bread by hand, so not every woman is a loaf kneader, but it was very common back in the day, and I just felt that was like an interesting little tidbit that I could take away from this book. Overall, this book was very enjoyable. I liked it. I had a good time reading it, and I would recommend it to anyone who is looking for a book on just some etymological tidbits or the way that words we use to describe women have come into our language today. I think it's really, really interesting, and I liked the work that Jenni Nuttall put together, so I really appreciate her work in putting this book together, and I enjoyed it, and I'm glad that I checked it out of the library to read because I had a great time reading it. If you've read this book or if you've read anything similar to this book, I would love to hear your thoughts or your suggestions below. I love getting suggestions. I try to follow up on every single one of them, so if you have any suggestions on what I could read next, put that in the comments below as well. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest